Hello, everyone. This is Carl from the Fellowship League, which is our platform used for three purposes: facts, cross, and discourse. So our purpose for this platform is to determine the facts of reality, and we believe that all facts lead to the person and the cross of Jesus Christ. And the only way for us to do that is through discourse or discussion. So for this, we're back again, and for another episode of special Q&A or special question answer sessions. And we're so lucky to have a guest, a wonderful guest right now. And he's not an ordinary guest. He's highly esteemed, and his name is Dr. Mark Surtees. I'm gonna read his biography here a little bit. He earned his PhD in zoology for his original research in the hormonal control of seasonal breeding. He currently lives in Edinburgh, close to the sites of geological significance, which were studied by uniformitarian geologists such as James Hutton and Charles Lyell. And he has been working for pharmaceutical industry for more than 30 years, mainly in medical research. And he's currently a member of one of my favorite creation websites, Edinburgh Creation Group. He is currently an active interest. He has an active interest in evidence-based creation biology, fossils, and geology. So without further ado, for this topic, Biology 101, Evolutionism versus Creationism, I want to introduce Dr. Marc Surtees. How are you doing, Dr. Mark?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And it's a great privilege for me to be invited to answer your Q&A. And I hope it's beneficial to everybody.
Yes, this is a wonderful opportunity because the first time I heard about ECG is during my times of musings and during my pursuit of truth. I've been like a victim of such questions about evolution. And why is there such diversity even within the Christian group, there are diversity in terms of origins and interpretation of Genesis. So maybe in this session, it will be worthwhile of discussing this important topic. So first and foremost, Dr. Mark, before we proceed to the main event, it's okay if you share a little bit of how did you ended up in this interest of biology, studying of paleontology, fossils, geology, and coming into a belief of creationism. It's okay if you explain a bit of the journey.
Yeah. Okay. So I've always been interested in biology. Biology has been my kind of favorite subject, even when I was a schoolboy. I always wanted to study biology. I was always sort of interested in the sort of medical side of things. So that was my interest. But I was also I became a Christian at quite a young age, around the age of 10. So when I was working my way through school, I came across the whole idea of evolution. And I realized that actually there's a bit of a problem here, because my Bible tells me that God created the earth and everything in it in 6 days. And it's all very good. And my understanding of the Bible is that that's fairly recent, not millions of years ago. So I had a bit of a problem trying to work out what I was going to do with this information I was getting from my science teachers, telling me that the universe was billions of years old and all about evolution. So at that point in time, really, I didn't have any way to sort of work out a logical argument for a creationist position. But I trusted the Bible, that God would not lie in His word if He said what He said, and I believed that was true. So I just had to wait a little while before I could really get some answers to the questions about how that all works out. But then as I moved through college and university, I met up with some creationists, and so some British creationist organizations that had been formed probably back in the 1950s, 60s, and were active in promoting creation. And there I started to find some of the scientific answers to the questions I was asking. So as I went through all my university training, 4 years as a undergraduate and 3 years postgraduate research, the thing that struck me was that there isn't really a lot of evidence for evolution. Everybody talks about how it's a fact and how it's true, but the evidence, where's the actual evidence? Where's the details of the evidence? And I didn't really find any. And the more I read about creationist literature, the more I saw that actually the evidence isn't there, because it didn't happen. And one book that was very influential, of course, would have been Genesis Flood, which came out in the 60s, a very important book that influenced a lot of people and really set them on the path of creationism. And another book that was very important was one also by Morris and Whitcomb, The World That Perished, which is about the flood of Noah. So this information was all coming to me at the same time as I was studying biology. And really, basically, I didn't see any reason to abandon the belief in the fact that the earth is young and God created the animals and the plants that we see on this earth. Although it's not quite as simple as some people might think, but it basically, I had no reason to abandon my faith and no reason to abandon a straightforward understanding of the Bible, which was actually the historical position of the church for thousands of years, that God created the world in 6 days, all very good. And he's the one who is the creator, and we owe him all that we are.
Yeah, that's very encouraging, Dr. Mark. It's a good thing you mentioned the Genesis flood. I think that was written by Dr. Henry Morris. I think that's one of the things that very suitable read for I think throughout all generations if they want to understand really the historicity of the flood. Yeah, I guess that. So moving now to the first question here is the question about fossil record. So Dr. Mark, how can you explain the fossil record? Evolutionists would say that yeah, or even other people would even interpret fossils when they find a bone in the soil. They can interpret it by carbon dating all this as millions of years. So is the fossil record a fact for evolution? How are we so sure of the dates, and what methodology do they use?
Right. Okay, well, the fossil record is interesting because when Darwin wrote his Origin of Species by the Means of Natural Selection, he had a problem because there was no fossil evidence for what he was saying. And he was confident that there would be plenty of fossils that would prove evolution to be true, but when he wrote, there wasn't that evidence. And actually, although we've dug up an awful lot of fossils, we're really actually in the same position. The evidence of the fossils is consistent with creation. So the evidence is the same. We all have the same evidence. It's very important to remember that. We don't have different evidence. There is evidence, and it's how you interpret that evidence that's important. And one thing about the fossils is how you can know how old a fossil is. And actually, it's not very simple. So, in fact, most of the time, you can't use carbon-14, for example, because it only works for young ages. So what they do is measure the age of fossils indirectly. They can't take a fossil bit of dinosaur bone and work out how old it is. And because it's in sedimentary rock, actually you can't date sedimentary rock by radiometric methods that they use, typically things like potassium argon or uranium lead, other methods as well. You can't actually date the sedimentary rocks that the fossils are found in. So what they generally do is they find a layer of volcanic rock, either above or below that rock. They can apply the methods to that, the radiometric dating methods, and they can come up with a number, an estimate of what they think the age is. The important thing to remember about these methods is they are only ever going to give you answers in the millions or billions of years, because they can't give you an age that is younger than that. They don't work for that age because of the fact that the half-life is very long. So they come up with millions and billions of years, and they come up with, say, okay, a few centimeters down below, maybe the layer where the fossils are, they come up with an age, and then they would say, well, okay, so this fossil is about that age. But a lot of the time, they're not even close. They basically have various index fossils which allow them to assign an age to a rock. And so while they can do some radiometric dating, a lot of the time it's down to the layers of rock and working out how long it would take the layers to form and coming up with the best estimate of the age. So it's a bit of an imprecise science. And a lot of the time, it's the fossils that give you the age, although evolutionists will tell you that's not true. But in fact, a lot of the time it happens where they find a fossil and they know they believe that the fossil is dated from a certain period of time. Therefore, the rock it's in must be that old. But there's a lot of circular arguments going on, and the dating methods can't, as I say, be directly applied to a piece of rock, a piece of bone, and it's an estimate. And often they have inconsistencies, and they find. But if they find a certain fossil in a rock and they believe it's only appeared at a certain time, that rock must be younger. So a good example was when they once, about 10 years ago, they discovered what looked like bird tracks in rock that was considered to be about. But then they went back and said, well, they came up with an age which actually became different. And they decided actually now the rock is much younger, about 50 million years old. So again, it was influenced very much by the fact that the fossil was in the rock and it had to be a certain age, and they kind of like, they knew the answer they wanted and they found it. So you have to be a bit suspicious about some of the ages and how certain they can be, because a lot of the time they can't be that certain. And there's lots of questions about how fast rocks are laid down and when they're laid down, which basically mean that they're basically fitting the fossils into a sequence based on the evolutionary theory of the day. Okay, yes. So even today, when we've been looking for fossils for 150 years, sorry, since Darwin, we still have incomplete fossil record. One thing that is interesting is the lack of transitional forms. There still are no really convincing transitional forms, as far as I can work out, according to what I've read. They will claim that there are, but the thing about a transitional form is it's a rather fluid term. So basically, it's something that would be considered to be a morphological intermediate. In other words, it has features, some of which are primitive and some of which are derived. They don't call them advanced because that's kind of too teleological, and you can't have teleology. There's no direction in evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So they talk about primitive and advanced features, or derived features rather. But how do you know whether it's primitive or derived? Unless you fit it within an evolutionary paradigm, those things don't make any sense. So that's part of the problem. And transitional becomes very flexible. So a good transitional form would be a mixture of features lower in the fossil record than something with features that are considered to be derived. So, but the problem is direct ancestors are never found in the fossil record.
Right. So basically, basically it's like what you're saying. There's actually like there's no fossil record at all to support evolution. But which brings into my mind, Sir Mark, which is for archaeologists and for any historian to go into an area of excavation, and then let's say they find a bone. What should they expect? What ought to be their assumption first for them when they dug up
So
a bone?
archaeologists. Well, you're talking about a bone from of an animal.
Yes, yeah. Because lately in our country,
archaeology, I'm thinking human bones.
Yeah, human. Well, either I think human bones or yeah, because it's missing link, right? So there's a combination of human and monkey. But lately there's a discovery like they call it Homo luzonensis, and they put it in the family of I think Australopithecus, or within the missing link there. In between. So
yeah,
for a beginner, for an archaeologist as a profession, what ought to be their assumptions in your standards, sir?
Well, I think it basically comes down to what your belief system is. If you believe that there is no creator and you believe that the earth is billions of years old, you're going to have certain assumptions. If you're a Christian and you read your Bible and you believe your Bible, you're going to assume that the earth is young, and so that's going to be a big influence on how you interpret that fossil. So it really comes down to your belief system, your worldview. It's very important. People think that scientists sort of work in a sort of neutral, objective way, but they don't. Everybody has a bias. Everybody has a worldview which influences the way they interpret a fossil. So if you're looking for an intermediate between apes and humans, and you dig up a fossil that looks like it has a mixture of features, you're going to make. If you're an evolutionist, you're going to say, well, this is proof of evolution. If you're a creationist, you're going to look at it and say, well, this is more likely to be a variety of ape. And that's where I would suggest that's the situation. So, and in fact, if you look at the human evolution, if you look at the literature, it's a real mess at the moment. Bizarre fossil apes, which basically are apes, but they're different from the apes we have today, and they get kind of put into some sort of sequence But at the end of the day, it's all very subjective where you put them. And a lot of the time, these fossils are incomplete, they're broken up, and the way you put them back together is very, very important. So again, if you're an evolutionist, you're inclined to reconstruct your fossil to basically support your theory. Whereas if you're a creationist, you're going to reconstruct that fossil to say a bit more, you're going to be tending to see it more as an ape rather than a human if it's ape-like. And again, if you've got a fossil that's human-like, you're going to consider it a variety of human. But in between the two, actually, there is still a big gap. So the fossil apes are still very much fossil apes, with their facial features, their brain size, the way they moved around, very ape-like, and anything that's considered human, which would be like Homo erectus or Homo neanderthal, they are recognizably human. So again, it's a question of there are gaps. How important that gap is depends again on what you believe. So if you believe in evolution, you're going to believe you can fill that gap in. One day you'll find a fossil ape human type mixture and you'll have proof of evolution, but so far they haven't found them. And the other thing's worth bearing in mind when it comes to the fossils is, as a creationist, we would actually expect greater variety in the past, and many of the extinct creatures that we see are actually different, and some of them could appear to be transitional because they're morphological intermediates, because they share features from different classes of creature. But if you take platypus, for example, which is a living creature in Australia today, it's a mixture of reptile and mammal features. And if it was found in rocks 100 million years old, it would be considered a transitional fossil. But we know it's not transitional fossil. It's a modern creature that's been around, living today, nothing to do with evolution. So it's, again, evolutionists are able to interpret the fossils in a certain way which is consistent with their worldview, whereas we creationists would say no, the fossil is not actually evidence of a transition, it's evidence of more variety in the past, but we can still discern gaps between the various fossils that are sometimes put in a sequence. And this applies to just about every fossil sequence that you can find in your biology textbooks: birds, whales, even the human fossil sequence. I mean, it's not convincing if you come at it with an objective viewpoint, and especially if you come at it with the creationist viewpoint and look at it carefully, you find that actually the evidence is not that strong.
I just want to reinforce what you said, sir. It's very interesting on what you said about presuppositions. Yeah, that's very important to emphasize on presuppositions, because it's the belief. Because as I'm a history student currently, and I just had a class on pre-Philippine Hispanic times. So our subject is more on pre-Spanish Philippines. And as introduction to that subject or to that course, our professor taught us the common timeline. Where we have the Paleolithic age and Neolithic age, and then going all the way to the idea of the Cro-Magnon variety of missing links, and then thousands of years old, from millions to thousands of years old, and then they enter now the civilization and the idea of savagery, barbarism, and then civilization. And I think that fits firmly on what you said, that maybe that's the product of such a belief system of evolution. You're right, sir.
A civilization gradually evolving, people starting off as savages and then gradually becoming farmers, and things improving slowly but surely. Yeah, very much an evolutionary process applied to history. Whereas, in fact, if you go back, if you look back in the ancient world, you have civilization appearing very, very quickly with very advanced civilizations. You just take the pyramids of Egypt. Who built those? I mean, they are built using engineering techniques which we know nothing about. So they are very advanced civilization, and evidence suggests that they were very advanced right from the beginning. So that's actually a problem for the evolutionary scenario, because that's not what you see. If you look at the history, the actual evidence, civilizations have been very quickly in different parts of the world, and there's no real evolutionary explanation for that.
Right, sir. Right. That's very clear. Because I think Stonehenge is also another example, perhaps. Uh,
Yeah.
so, do you have any?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, sir. Sorry for the signal. Do you have anything more to share about the fossil record, sir? I would love to hear.
Now on the fossils, I think so. We've covered most of the ground, the important things about the fossils. We can move on to another question.
All right, sir. Well, that's very clear. Yeah, I hope you viewers are still all right. Forgive us for the connection. Okay, so second question will now focus now on the cell. So
Yeah.
how can creation defend the complexity of the cell? Do cells lead to an intelligent design or an unguided process?
Yeah. So the cell is interesting because Darwin, when he wrote his book, he considered the cell to be a blob of jelly. Not very complicated. He couldn't see anything. He looked at a cell, nothing there. It's just a blob of jelly, because they didn't have the microscopes today that we have. So to him, it wasn't that much of a problem. You know, he could imagine a cell sort of a bag of jelly just appearing somewhere in a pond. But now we know that the cell is much, much more complicated than Darwin ever imagined. And the more we look at the cell, the more complexity we find. So that's a massive problem for evolution, because the simplest bacterial cell has about 300 genes, has all the machinery to actually make it work. So you can't have genes floating around in some sort of primordial soup, because they'll just break down very quickly because they're not very stable. DNA doesn't last very long in solution. So you've got to have basically everything there all at the same time for the cell to work. So evolution needs a massive miracle just to get to the first simplest cell. And that's a massive problem for evolution. They've got no way of getting there. And that's if you're considering a bacterial cell, which might be considered fairly simple, whereas the cells that we're made up of are much more complicated. We've got a nucleus, we've got all sorts of things called organelles, which are like microscopic factories, and power stations that make the cell work. And so the unit of life is the cell. And until you have a cell, you can't actually do anything. Even evolutionists admit that evolution can't proceed until you have cells which can evolve, or something very like a cell which can evolve. But they have no mechanism. There's no workable hypothesis for the origin of the first cell. So that's a miracle they need at the beginning just to get life going. So they think we believe in miracles. Well, they believe in miracles.
Absolutely, sir. Yeah, I think I firmly agree with that too. I think they're reverse. I think it's a religion. that's
Well,
it.
indeed. Yeah.
Right.
Then you've got how to get cells to work together, how you go from single cell to multiple cell creatures. That again is another miracle. So there's many steps in evolution from the cell upwards before you can get to something like an animal. And there's no way, they don't know how it happened. They have theories, they have some ideas, but really it just comes down to wishful thinking in the end of the day. It really does prove, it's a bit like, if you take a car, for example, you've got to have all the bits together in the engine for the engine to work. If you've got to take one piece out, your engine probably isn't going to go. The same with a cell. You take one piece out, your cell is not going to work. Unless you've got it all there working together, your cell's just going to die. And that's a big problem for evolution.
Go ahead, sir.
Somebody had to put the first cell together. It's not going to happen by chance.
Right, sir. I think it's very it's a very clear argument already for if saying that, right. I mean, I think they call it irreducible complexity. That if how can one cell evolve from one part? So it's actually all parts has to be there for a cell to function. So it's really, until now it fails to be debunked. Now we talk about cell now. So let's evolve that cell a little bit, and we move now to the next question, more on the tree of life, because as time goes by, as cell evolves, comes the animals. Now here's the thing: there's what they call phylogeny challenge. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, sir, but it's like there's a missing gap that creationists cannot bring out. So how can you explain, sir, the the latest design of the tree, the phylogenetic tree.
Well,
And what are your thoughts on that?
yeah. That was interesting. You talk about the latest design of the tree, which suggests that it's changed. So already you have an interesting question. Why has it changed? So the tree that Darwin envisaged no longer exists. His phylogeny doesn't exist anymore. And theirs was based on external features you can measure. Basically, look at the bones, the shape of the bones, the way the bones are put together, the type of bones you had, and you could get similarities, and you could put something in a sequence which was kind of evolutionary, and then Darwin had this idea of splitting off into different branches. But that tree no longer exists, and genetics has actually resulted in a massive rearrangement of that tree. And the interesting thing is, you read some of the literature where they look at the genetics, and they look at the genes, and they can come up with a evolutionary, a genetic tree, where they can say this creature is related to that creature, and they must have had a common ancestor. But often that tree is different if you just look at the bones. So if you take the bones and you construct a tree, you end up with a different tree from if you take the genes. So when they put them together, they basically make a compromise. So it depends on putting all these features together, and they run through a statistical process where they come out with the most likely phylogenetic tree. But the thing is, it changes all the time. And if you add in more features, or you get a new creature, suddenly it changes and you have a different tree. So my problem with that is, well, how can you trust this tree? It just seems to change. And one very recent example was where they looked again at the dinosaurs. Now, up until it's probably maybe 10 years, actually, when I say recently, but dinosaurs were considered to be two types of dinosaur. Well, now they reanalyzed all the data. They got some new data, they put it all together, and now they've got three types of dinosaur. So there's a paper I can send you if you want to read it. Rather involved and complicated, but basically they've changed the whole dinosaur phylogeny. The dinosaur tree now, instead of having two branches, has three branches. They did that mainly to make the birds fit in, because they consider birds to be dinosaurs, which I would disagree with entirely. So the big problem for me is, you put all this stuff together, you treat all the different features kind of equal weight, and do some statistical analysis and come out with a most likely tree. Well, you throw in a different set of variables, you come up with a different tree. So the tree is not fixed, it changes all the time. And is it really evidence for evolution? Again, it's the whole underlying assumption is that there's a common ancestor right at the beginning, one single cell, universal ancestor, and we all everything evolved from that. And that's your assumption that you're using when you do statistical analysis. You fit all the data into that assumption. Whereas a creationist would say, well, no, we don't believe in universal common descent. We believe that God created distinct types of creatures. So while you can have quite a lot of variety within a group of creatures of what we consider to be a created kind, for example, take horses. You can demonstrate evolution of horses, but it's horses changing into horses, and that's what you've got. You've not got something else. You've not got horses changing into camels, for example, or some other creature. So we have, instead of one tree where everything linked together, creationists will have lots of trees of different types of animals, and we can look at that data in the same data in a different way, and we come up with different assumptions. Basically, we have a group of creatures, so you'll have the family tree of dog kind, for example, which will include wolves and coyotes and domestic dogs, or you have the horse tree, which is quite interesting one to look at, where horses have definitely changed over time, adapting to different circumstances. But again, it's limited within a group of creatures. So if that's evolution, then I'm an evolutionist, but that's not evolution with a big E, evolution where we're all descended from some common ancestor. One evolutionist put it, we're all fish. We have our grandmother was a fish. Well, no, our grandmother wasn't a fish, because fish is a distinct kind of creature God created, and we're different. So it's basically a statistical construct, subject to change, and it changes all the time.
Right, sir. That's very.
So it's not really.
Yeah, it's not really a challenge, sir. I guess if we categorize those things, right? you mentioned that there's no such thing as an evidence where a kind comes from other kind and it can change to a different kind. So it seems that what we can only observe is different varieties of a kind. So
Yeah,
basically,
absolutely.
if one animal changes from one kind to another, that's macroevolution. If in terms of varieties within a kind, it's microevolution. It seems that what is only scientific is the varieties within the kind, not the observation, which is fallacious, that an animal can change from one kind to another. So it would seem that what we can only see is our varieties, not one kind to
Yeah,
another
I
kind.
agree with that. Yeah, yeah. And I wouldn't even call it microevolution. I call that variation,
A variation.
because by calling it microevolution, then the evolutionists say, well, if you've got microevolution, you just have a bit more, and you get macroevolution. So I would not use the term microevolution. I would say that's variation within a kind. It's a variety of creature of a certain kind. It's not microevolution, because that gives too much to the evolutionists, because that really is opening the door, if you like, to the whole idea of macroevolution. So some evolutionists would put it, you believe in steps, but you don't believe in stairs. Well, no, not quite the situation. So there are limits. You can only go so far. There's always a limit. And even when humans try to breed different types of creature, they try to, for example, pigeons. Darwin was a fan of pigeons. He liked breeding pigeons, but you only ever get pigeons, and pigeons are a different variety. You never ever get anything else. A pigeon doesn't turn into something else. A dog. The dog varieties are all dog. They're all recognizably dog, all the way from the little Chihuahua to the Saint Bernard, but they're all dogs. Lots of different phylogenetic trees, but they're all separate trees, and they're not evidence of evolution.
Right, right. So I think that's very coherent there. Yeah, that's with a small e evolution, right? With a small e. Speaking of kind, so we move now to the flood of Noah, because that's one of my favorite stories in the Bible.
Yeah.
How can Noah brought God told Noah to bring two of each kind. So how can you explain now the flood of Noah in relation to the current biological life right now, state right now? And then maybe you can
Right.
give an account a little bit
So
of why different evolution, like theistic evolutionists, young Earth, old Earth, differ on their interpretation on the flood of Noah.
yeah. So the flood of Noah is very important, actually, and it's something that probably we need to emphasize more when we're talking about this whole issue of creation evolution. Because if there was a flood, and if it was worldwide, we would expect there to be evidence there of that flood. Now, evolutionists, geologists, classical geologists would say there's no evidence of a flood, whereas creation geologists would say actually there's plenty of evidence for a flood, and we would say that because of the layers of sedimentary rock is laid down by water, and you need a lot of water to lay down all that rock. Now, it doesn't mean that all the sedimentary rock was laid down in the flood, but a lot of it would have been laid down in the flood. And that you need a lot of water over a short period of time, you get a lot of sedimentation. And if you look at the way the rock layers are put together, now I'm not a geologist, I'm a biologist, but I've read a lot of the geological stuff. And basically, the features of the rock layers, the sedimentary rock layers, are consistent with deposition during a massive flood. And there's also this feature in the geological column called the Great Unconformity, where it seems like the rock layers have been worn smooth, and then layers of rock have been put on top of that unconformity. So there's a break, if you like, in the geological column, which is consistent with the start of the flood. Now, there's a bit of debate about whether that's the actual start of the flood, but it seems fairly consistent with what we observe in the rocks. And then we see sediments put on top of that, and in those sediments we find different creatures. So the start of the flood is evidence. It is found in the geological record. There's evidence for it, which is consistent with the worldwide flood. And then there's the issue of why do Christians differ on whether the flood was worldwide or not? Now, it's a puzzle to me, because actually, even people who don't believe in a worldwide flood, who are Christians who read their Bible, would, I think, agree that the Bible seems to suggest it was worldwide. Well, and why not go with a worldwide flood? Because basically, if you accept a worldwide flood, you've got to accept an awful lot of other things as well. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians don't want to appear to be crazy or stupid or just weird, so they don't want to go with the whole idea of a flood of Noah, which covered the whole earth and which wiped out all life on the earth except what was in the ark. Well, all air-breathing land creatures, except those which were in the ark. So I can't really answer why an old Earth creationist doesn't want a global flood, because generally speaking, they don't believe in a global flood. They think it was just local. It doesn't make any kind of sense to me. If it's a local flood, you can just walk away. Why? And you don't need to save all the animals because they're all over the place. So for me, the Bible is clear. It has to be a worldwide flood. It has to be very quick. It was very, very violent, very catastrophic. It was the biggest catastrophe up until then. It's the biggest catastrophe. There's not been one since. But there's a bigger one coming, which is why the flood's important. Because the flood is actually a picture of what's going to happen later when the whole world is destroyed in the second coming. But we come back to that because I think it's important. I've got some thoughts on that and why creation is important in closing remarks. But go back to the animals. So you've got this flood. So you've got Noah told to build a massive ship, bigger than any ship ever built at the time, up until quite recently, actually, up until the 1800s. Nothing was of a similar size. And he's told to collect all the land animals, all the air-breathing land creatures in the ark. And the interesting thing is he doesn't have to go and collect them himself, which would be an impossible task. If you read your Bible, it says God brought the animals to Noah, and he just basically loaded them onto the ark. And so you've got Noah building an ark, probably taking 100 years to do it, and then all the animals coming to him, being put on the ark and kept safe. But the thing is, you have to remember that the animals then are not the animals now. So what we've got today is a great variety of a limited type of creatures, whereas in Noah's day there were other types of creatures which don't exist anymore. For example, dinosaurs. For example, another type of fossil animal that doesn't exist now, which is actually marine, so it doesn't really count, but it's a good example of the marine reptiles. And then you've got things like pterosaurs flying around, which don't fly around now. So there was what Noah collected together, or what God brought to Noah was representative of each basic kind of creature, representing the creatures that God originally created in the beginning, and they were preserved on the ark. But the marine creatures didn't have to come on the ark because they could survive in the water. And then you've got what you find in the rock layers is at some point Noah's ark lands on the new surface of the new earth that came out of the water. Animals went off from the ark and started to repopulate the earth, and the people came off as well. So what you've got afterwards, so at some point in the geological column, you've got the end of the flood. Now, there's a lot of debate about where that is, but for me, if you've got footprints in the rocks, animals making footprints in the rocks, they have to come off the ark because they were all wiped out. And I believe that the violence of the flood, the word used for the flood is marble, which is basically a very violent catastrophe. It completely obliterated everything. So there was no trace left. So I don't believe, as a lot of creationists, I disagree with a lot of creationists, that all the fossils were laid down in the flood. I would say most of the fossils were actually after the flood, which explains an awful lot more of the fossil record, because what you have is a record of animals taking over the land again, so new animals appearing as time goes on, and then variety within the basic kinds or the basic types of animal as time went on. So and I would say, for example, dinosaurs is a good example. The dinosaurs in the rocks were not buried during the flood; they were buried after the flood. But I would say dinosaurs that Noah put on the ark were a very limited number of dinosaurs, basic dinosaur kind, and what you've got in the rocks after the flood is variations of dinosaurs. So I would say actually dinosaurs were small creatures before the flood, and they became very large afterwards. basically because there was very rapid change in the creatures after the flood. And the reason you find the fossils buried in these animals fossilized in these layers of sediment is because actually the Earth was very geologically unstable. So the flood was a massive catastrophe, wiped out everything. But then after the flood, you've got lots of geological activity going on, and because of that, you get lots of sedimentation occurring. And you get, for example, you get the sea covering a lot of America, not North America, where there are lots of dinosaurs, and burying the dinosaurs. But there's evidence there of basically a long period of time, more than a year. So you've got to allow for the fact that there's more than a year going on here, because dinosaurs are building nests, laying eggs, eggs are developing and hatching out into embryos, and all of that takes more than a year. So I think you've got to say, I would say most of the fossils of land creatures were after the flood, not during the flood. And that's quite an important difference, and it explains a lot of the evidence that we see. Whereas if you say all the fossils were produced by the flood, you've got to have an awful lot of sort of subsidiary theories to try and explain how you get animals walking around in a flood, building nests in a flood. How does that happen? It doesn't happen. It doesn't. It's not consistent. I don't think it's consistent. So there's mainly in Europe, there are creationists who would hold to that position, whereas the American creationists tend to go with all the fossils in the flood, which I would disagree with, because I don't think that's consistent with the evidence that you've got.
Right. So how about human beings? Is it possible for 7 billion people to come from 8 people in the earth?
Very easy. Very, very easy. If you do the maths, it's very simple. Actually, it would only take a couple of thousand years. Because if you look at Noah's sons, well, he had 3 sons. Now you look at how many children they had. Each of those sons had, I think, five sons, and some of them had as many as 11 sons, and they weren't counting the daughters. The daughters weren't counted. So each of Noah's sons had probably upwards of 10, possibly 20 children. So that's a multiplication from 3 to 20. No, sorry, 3 to 60.
It's a matter of mathematics.
So if you do the maths, and if they carried on like that, you have billions of people very, very quickly over a couple of thousand years. So it's not a problem. Not a problem. I mean, okay, so there were plagues, there were wars, just as well, because otherwise we'd reached 9 billion. What we are at 9 billion now, I think, very quickly, but we didn't. So there's absolutely no problem with actually coming up with that many people from Noah's family. Very, very simple, very, very quick and easy. If you've got, because today, you see, most people, I've got 2 sons. That's me. We're done. But back at my parents' generation, families of 10 children were quite common. And the Victorian era, also quite common. But there was high infant mortality. But you've got to go back to the people that came off the ark. I would suggest to you that infant mortality was very low initially. We only have bad infant mortality back in the Victorian era, 100 years ago, because bad sanitation, bad healthcare, and all the rest of it. And also, human beings are actually getting full of genetic defects now, but they wouldn't have been back in Noah's day. So we've got a massive genetic burden, which basically makes us feeble in comparison to the people that came off the ark. So they were very fit and very healthy. They had lots of children. Not a problem to repopulate the earth.
So in imagination, sir, how do you think human life was before? How healthy they were? What do you think were
very
the
healthy?
factors?
Very healthy. I think if you looked at Adam and Eve, he would be a Superman in comparison. He'd probably been he would not have injured himself or tripped over anything, because his reflexes were so good. His immune system would have been so good. How else did he live to 900 years? It had to be fit and healthy. So we are degenerate mutants. We are impoverished in comparison. Adam was also extremely intelligent, and the early people were extremely intelligent. Noah built an ark to house all the animals. The technology involved in that is incredible. And even after people came off the ark, they built the pyramids. They built the ziggurats in South America. Civilization was all over the place, all very quickly. So the whole idea of sort of some primitive caveman grunting along and sort of figuring out how to make fire. That's just myth. That's just evolutionary myth. There's no evidence for that. And there is evidence of people living in caves. Well, why do you live in a cave? Well, I would say you live in a cave to avoid being eaten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. It's a good place to hide. But they didn't. They weren't doing it because they were primitive. It was a good place to hide until you built your walls. So human beings, we are very, very feeble in comparison. So Noah's generation as well, they would have been very fit. They lived. Noah's children lived for 600 years. After that, gradually there was a decline, basically again because changing environment, also because God has said that we're not going to live that long. God put a limit on human life, and that's important to basically limit the amount of sin that we could do and the amount of damage we could do to the environment. By cutting short our life, we can only do so much harm to the world just as well. But that's not what it meant. That's not what was meant to be. And that's really where the whole idea of creationism becomes important when we get to question number 6.
Yeah.
But
last question, sir. Last question before we move to the next question is the climate.
Yeah.
What do you think, sir, is the climate conditions and the weather conditions during that time? I'm acting like a little kid, very curious of what do you think happened during the pre-flood? Yeah.
The climate before the flood would have been very, very pleasant. It would have been ideal. After the flood, I think things have gone wrong. I think the climate would have been. There's lots of evidence. If you read the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for example, there were famines, which seemed to be quite extensive famines. Why were there famines? Because basically the climate was all messed up. And we think we've got problems now with climate change. Well, they had bigger problems, and that's why they basically had famines. That's why Jacob and his family ended up in Egypt, because Joseph there was able to grow crops in the Nile Delta, which had water supply, but everywhere else they were living in a famine. So the weather after the flood was very changeable, and we're still kind of recovering from the flood, and that's a case all over. So a lot of the climate change I think we see today, even it could be down to recovery after the flood. We're sort of oscillating between extremes, and I'm not really that convinced that we're the cause of climate change, but that's another story.
I see. Yeah, if Adam was here, maybe we can ask you, how can you solve the climate change during that time?
Yeah.
Maybe because there was a canopy of water, they say the oxygen was good.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've broken the world, basically. We've messed it up. We Adam and Eve were in a perfect world, and we've messed it up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we really messed it up. Okay, so second to last question. I think this is something that you really love to explain. This is your specialization. What is this discontinuity in the biological world that I've been hearing lately? How is this still consistent with the creationist model? Yeah. And what is this discontinuity? What is the creationist model?
Okay, so I mean there are lots of creationist models, but if we think about biological creation biology, if you like, we would make certain assumptions based on our understanding of the Bible. So we read in the Bible that God created various kinds of creature, and they reproduced according to their kind. So it's a whole idea here. You've got created kinds, or some people call them baromins, or basic types of creature, which reproduced fairly consistently with limited variation. So that's a hypothesis that we would put forward. And then we say, let's go and look at the evidence. Does the evidence support that hypothesis, or do we have to abandon that hypothesis because the evidence actually supports a different situation? So when we actually look at the fossils, as we've already talked about the fossils, there's actually a big problem with the fossils, because evolution predicts continuity, that you've got basically common ancestors at every point in your branching of the tree. But the problem is they don't have the common ancestors. They can't ever point to a common ancestor. The common ancestor is always like this creature or similar to this creature. They've got sort of sisters or cousins, but they've never actually got a common ancestor. So that's consistent with creation, because we say, yeah, there will be discontinuity because God created different kinds of creatures and different kinds of animals and plants, and they don't change into from one kind to another. So you've got a dog doesn't change into a cat doesn't change into a dog. You've got but you've got great variety within that kind. Cats are a good illustration of that, because you've got different sorts of cats. You've got everything from a lion, tiger, down to your domestic cat, which people keep as a pet. But they're all, for me, they're all cat kind, and there would have been one sort of cat variety on the ark, and all these cats have descended from those creatures that were on the ark. But you don't have a link to some sort of ancestor of cats and dogs, for example. There is no ancestor to cats and dogs. It doesn't exist. You can't. There's no fossil they can come up with and say this is the ancestor of cats and dogs. Or they try, but you go looking in the literature, you won't find it. What you find is you've got creatures that are like dogs, creatures like cats, and you don't get. There's no link between the two. So that is a major prediction of creation, and it is consistent with the fossil record and the fact that they don't actually have all these common ancestors, and there's a discontinuity which at one point back in the 60s and 70s caused people to come up with a different theory of evolution, where basically you've got sudden appearance of creatures, to explain why in the fossil record you don't have gradual evolution, you've got sudden evolution. So that theory is sort of comes and goes. Sometimes some people like it, some people don't, but basically it's to explain the discontinuity in the fossil record. And that is, for me, is a very strong evidence of creation, that it is consistent with created certain kinds of animals which reproduce according to their. That's what we see in the fossil record. We see variety within a kind, and then other creationists have put quite a lot of work into trying to work out how you can demonstrate that discontinuity. When you look at the fossils, how you can work out what animals belong to which group. And that's kind of an area which is changing quite a lot. And there's a group in America, they're looking, they call it Barominology. They take the different creatures and they basically think they can discern different kinds of creature within a group and split them up into groups. And that's what you see. And again, take the fossil whales, so-called. So they've come up with a whole series of creatures that they consider to be evidence of whales evolving from land creatures. Well, if you actually look at it carefully, you've got to believe in evolution to see the continuity, because what you have is a creature living on land. You've got another kind of creature that's kind of amphibious, partly in land and partly in the water, like but you haven't got a whale. Okay, so we look at discontinuity, and you get discontinuity also in the rocks. Actually, interestingly. So, you've got different layers, but suddenly you've got a break. You've got one sort of rock, then you've got another sort of rock. So again, it's not gradual. So whereas if you have geology says it's all slow, gradual process. Well, it's not actually. So now they've gone from being slow and gradual to catastrophic events. So you've got different catastrophes, not as big as the Noah's flood. They're basically looking at nothing much happens in the geological record, then there's a sudden catastrophe. There's discontinuity everywhere. And if you look at human beings as the biggest example, we are completely different from any other creature on this planet. Even if you take the apes, people say, well, we're similar to the apes. Well, we're not similar to the apes. There's loads of differences between us and apes. And, you can write a book about it. So the evolutionists looking to make the differences seem small. Creationists mapping differences, and we see that as confirmation that God created distinct kinds of plants and animals, put them on a perfect world, and God's plan was that we would enjoy living on that perfect creation.
Right, sir. Forgive me for the connection earlier. It's really very clear in what you said about discontinuity. It's like evolutionists are really trying to find something just to fit their world. They're trying to complete that missing link, trying to complete the model for the sake of making their own view correct and making it true. Very crucial that you mentioned that, because it seems like evolutionists are trying to find always some ways to fix that model, just for the sake for their theory to be saved, or for the salvation of their theory. So based on what you said about the common ancestry, about the difference between apes and humans, and there's they don't see it, or maybe they're just hiding it. But there's really a discontinuity in the model. So last question now, sir, is
Sorry, some evolutionists do see discontinuity. That's why they come up with punctuated equilibrium, but it's kind of not really in favour. So they try to explain it away. But again, it's they're like, as you say, they're trying to save the theory of evolution, and it's a very flexible theory. It's very robust, and they can pretty much explain most things away. But a lot of it is really wishful thinking, to be honest.
Right. Wow. It's been it's been a great session that we have had together, sir. As a last question, as part of the last question, as a closing remark, also, sir. After all the things we've talked about, all the way from fossil record to phylogenetic tree to cell to biology and to the discrete continuity within the within the evolutionist model. Why is creationism so important, and how does this relate now to the person of Christ? How does this understanding affect my faith, and why is this so important?
Yeah, I think it's very important.
For the viewers who's watching us.
Yeah, it's very important. Very important for us because the Bible makes the claim that God created everything through Jesus Christ. He was the Word that God spoke creation into existence. And so if you say you're a Christian, you've got to believe the Bible. And I think if you start saying, well, actually, I don't believe the first chapter, you have a problem, because why should anybody believe anything? So that's important from that point of view. If you can't trust the first verse of the Bible, how can you trust the last verse? And so it's very important for our faith. If we start undermining our Bible, I don't know how people. Well, I think you do end up with losing everything. So when people lose a belief in the first chapters of the Bible, they lose belief in the whole of the Bible eventually, and it's very hard to keep believing if you don't believe the beginning. So it comes down to a matter of, do you believe what God has said about how He created the universe? Is that a historical record? And I believe it is a historical record. But it also is very important for how to understand the world today, because the Bible says God created Adam and Eve, put them in a perfect garden with every opportunity to enjoy life with Him. And what we see today doesn't fit with that. What we see today is suffering and death. Why is there suffering and death? Well, the Bible tells us why, because Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and as a result, we broke creation. We broke this world. This world is a mess. This world is broken because we have broken it. And so death is not normal. Suffering is not normal. Whereas for an evolutionist, death and suffering is normal. You know, it's what you'd expect. Well, we believe God created a very good world that functioned perfectly and gave us the ideal conditions for life, and we broke it by our disobedience. But even then, back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, if my memory is correct, God promised that somebody would come to crush Satan's head and to fix the problem. And that's why Jesus came into the world. So you go from creation, Adam and Eve, you go from broken world to the fact that God was going to do something about that. He promised even then He was going to do something about the brokenness of the world and fix it. And Jesus came into this world, and John's gospel says, God so loved the world, He sent His only Son. But the word world is cosmos. Jesus didn't just come to redeem people. He didn't just come to redeem you and me. He came to redeem the cosmos, to put it right. And that's important. So one day there will be no suffering and death, because that's not the original condition of the universe. God didn't want it that way. And we wrecked it. We broke it. And now God's going to fix it for us. And this also links in with a flood. So the flood's important because what happened after the flood? After the flood, there was a new world. And things have changed quite a lot, but there was a new creation. And that's important to believe that, because these are pictures, first of all, showing us that God is holy and will judge sin, but also that there was a way to put it right. So God restarted, if you like, the world after the flood. But this points forward to a final catastrophic end of the cosmos, which we read about in Revelation, when the whole world won't be flooded. Peter also writes about it in his letters, the first, the second letter of Peter especially, that the world will be burnt up and be replaced by a new heavens and a new earth in which there will only be righteousness. So being a creationist and believing in Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the fall and the flood is important, because it gives us a big picture of what's going to happen in the future, when there'll be a final catastrophe and a new heavens and a new earth where God's people will live in perfection with him. So creationism gives us a reason for hope. And if you don't believe in Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, you don't have an explanation for suffering and death. It's a problem. Why is there suffering and death if that's what has always been there? But we believe we have an explanation for that, because we know that we broke the world. Adam and Eve broke the world by deciding they could do it better than God. But there's hope, because Jesus came to redeem the cosmos, and there's going to be a final catastrophe in a new heaven and new earth, which we will enjoy forever.
Wow, amen. That's a very encouraging ending, Sir Mark. I guess it's like everything hinges on the person of Christ, and this ties in with the importance of understanding the first chapter of the Bible, as what you said. If as a Christian, if you believe in Christ, why won't you believe also the first chapter? But the first chapter or the first book of the Bible prophesies about Jesus. And Jesus cited the Genesis that in the beginning God created male and female, which is Adam and Eve. Yeah. And believing the first chapter, if you don't believe the first chapter, we cannot also understand and believe the last chapter. That's a very I think that's a very consistent.
Indeed. Yeah. When I started debating with the evolutionists, they said, this guy is a real Christian. He believes the Bible right from the beginning, which is quite an interesting comment.
That's good. He believes. That's a very good compliment, sir. He believes everything right from the beginning, right? All right. So when we talk a lot of meaningful and fruitful, mouthful, and meaty talks in this session, Sir Mark. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting this invitation. I believe the viewers will appreciate this and will be able to share this to our loved ones and to our friends who are in doubt and who are skeptics. And to you viewers who are watching us today,
that's good.
And to you viewers watching us today, we hope that you learned something. Remember, we're here for you guys. Our platform is for the purpose of determining the facts of reality and finding the center and the foundation, all of it on the person of Christ, and we do it via discourse and discussion. So please like and follow our Facebook page, the Fellowship League, and also our YouTube channel, the Fellowship League as well, the same title, same name, where you can be updated with our valuable content. So thank you very much for watching, guys, and we'll see you again in the next special Q&A, which is very interesting. So thank you very much, guys. See you next time.